Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started here. I am Mark Riley, as it says on the slide here, and today we're going to talk about putting Azure AD at the center of identity and authentication. Internally, we just kind of call it Azure as the center of the universe, but we've cleaned up the title a little bit. I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about Oxford Computer Group, the company I work for. I've been here 9 years in a couple weeks, turns out. We have a long track record of deploying identity. As you see here, 19 years, 900 enterprise projects, partner of the year. We've got to update some of those with more recent accolades. Some of the services we provide, planning and assessment. We do a lot of envisioning, looking at how to improve directory and identity services for organizations, some security assessments as well. Frank Urain is doing a lot of those and doing some really great work with that. And of course, we provide training across all of these products. We do deployment services, right? Pilots for Azure, for all the security components, E3, E5, MIM, Savient, a big practice in Savient. We'll be talking a little bit about their governance services in here. Software IDM, another IAM platform that we do a good deal of work with. And of course, all the work in Azure. And then we also offer some managed services, help desk support, monitoring, alerting, maintenance, managed platform services where we run systems for people. Also in high systems, IL4, 5, and 6, we're running some services for people directly in those clouds, and also some application management for third parties as well. And as we repeat again, the training services. So we'll take myself off the screen and return some real estate and get started with the webinar here. I am going to let you know I'm working out of a shared office space because I had some issues with internet at my home office, and I'm down to a single screen. So if anything goes wrong here today, I'm going to blame it on Comcast, and we'll just call it that. Our agenda today, though, is take a look at how we got here over the history. Always good to do some of that. And then talk about the benefits of moving to an Azure AD centralization. Talk about some like single identity, big tenet of zero trusted architecture that is top of mind for everybody. And one of the big things that I think we get out of doing all of our authentication and identity work in Azure AD is the identity protection that Azure provides, all of the signals that come in and allow us to do really good work about protecting those assets based on information we get about whether an identity is at risk, and steps that we can take to ameliorate that. And we do some work on the governance side with that as well, and we'll talk about those as well. Talk about making the move, actually doing the work in here, some of the issues and things we might run into that keep us from doing it, and then talk obviously about who can do this. There's some people who it'll make sense for, and some people it doesn't make sense for. Most of us probably down the road at some point it will, and then we'll talk briefly about some tools that we can use to help move this along. So this all started as kind of an idea, at least in my mind, started as an idea from our CTO, Oxford's Computer Group's CTO, James Cowling, that he called identity inversion. And this is this concept, we also call it AD as an app. So instead of AD being the center of the universe for identities and syncing those to the cloud and provisioning out to other applications, instead we home those accounts in Azure, and then we provision to ADDS, directory services, the on-premises directory services from Azure. So that's the inversion piece. And we take and, as we say, treat AD as an app. So if a user requires access to applications that are on premises and use ADDS for authentication, then we would provision a user into that. If the user no longer needs that access, we would deprovision the user from that system as well. And so this allows us to have better control over what's going on in AD and effectively reduce the load on that internal. So so brief history here, our new century. And this is a good statement. Modern applications use modern authentication. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? But as we modernize the business applications, we're moving that center of gravity for identities into the cloud because that's where we're doing the authentication. And as a result of this, in individuals' dependencies on ADDS diminishes. And it may not make sense to keep them all in that directory services on premises simply to provision them into Azure to give them the accounts. And a lot of this has come about with some of the customers we work with who have large, what's the term we want to use? Like in hospitality settings or manufacturing, we have a large number of front of the house workers who don't require a lot of the back end access that our classic information workers do. And so those users really don't need to be in AD on-prem. What they need is some way to authenticate to those cloud services we all now use for our 401k, for any benefits, insurance, those kinds of things. Need an account for those, but don't necessarily need an account in the what we used to in the old days would call the data processing section of the business, the knowledge workers, the back of the house. And some companies are moving very aggressively with this. I worked with a company here locally, a gaming company, who was extremely excited to take all their applications and move them over to modern authentication, and have done that. Other companies are moving more conservative, but there are certainly some benefits you can take from this, even if you're not moving it at light speed. So here's my little history lesson. Some animations that I've done within here. I'm not the best at it, but this kind of gives us the idea about what happened over time. We have users who sit on-prem, on premises, excuse me. They authenticate to ADDS DCs, and they access data that's located within the organization. Now, of course, we did have some workers outside the organization. We have those frontline workers. All those users are obviously using some sort of internet, but we have some frontline workers. And then we also have some salespeople are out there. I did a search for icons on here for workers, and all I came up with was this lineman and ant. So the ant will fill in for salespeople today in this discussion. So when you see that, it's just a sales guy, gal. Now, of course, these people outside had to connect to services, so they connect through either a firewall or reverse publishing. There's a number of ways that those things have been accomplished over the years, and of course, those people also still connect to the internet. But of course, over the earlier part of the century, we did have people who added applications. We added all of these SaaS applications and start doing those things. And of course, we had to add an ADFS system to do that authentication for us, and ADFS proxies those AD on-prem authentications for federation to these services to the cloud. Now, in addition to those workers who worked outside the organization, of course, we have some workers who just, instead of working in the office, worked somewhere else, worked remotely, worked at home, whatever it might happen to be, and that was pretty standard stuff. And those users then, as we added more authentication or more SaaS applications, started using Azure for authentication, whether that was just to Office 365 or additional applications. ADFS might have still been around for some unique cases, but as we move forward into 2020, we all know what happened. Everybody decamped for home, except for perhaps maybe that one guy who kept staying in the office and couldn't get him out, or somebody who went in to do the work that had to be done inside the office. Now, with all these people at home, we cut back on the number of domain authentications on premises, and also reduced the data load a little bit on-prem as well. But of course, now we start with the next segment here, where we're working with zero trust, and of course people are starting to come back to the office. So we've got users come back to the office. We still have some users who are out there, but as these users come back to the office, they notice that this person who stuck around and did the work while they were there has implemented some zero trust, and some of that is micro-segmentation. That is, those users do not have direct access to the corporate resources. They may be on a separate network that goes directly to the internet. And so their authentication path now is directly out to Azure. not using the on-prem DCs as much, ADFS tends to go away. So we get rid of that. That piece drops. And then as we notice, we're using fewer on-premises AD authentications, we can start reducing the number of DCs that we have in the organization, because these users are connecting, as you see here, hairpinning back around to reach internal resources. So we're treating everyone as if they're on a quote unquote, air quotes here, untrusted network. So these people sitting at their desks inside, no different than the people sitting outside. This makes conditional access policies much easier. Just makes everything a little easier to focus on. And now that everybody's able to work from wherever, our salespeople will go off and hang out either at the beach or maybe a picnic, because we know salespeople love picnics. So why do we want to do this? What are the real benefits? And there are some serious benefits here. As we reduce that internal infrastructure of ADDS, we all know what a load that is. AD takes a lot of maintenance. We have to make sure the servers stay in sync, that all the replication is happening. We have enough servers to provide for everyone. As we're able to reduce that number, we're going to free up resources that we don't need. We'll be able to take down machines, probably need fewer administrators, probably also have fewer help desk calls related to the on-premises. Now, those people will be helping people with SaaS applications, so you probably won't save a lot of effort there, but there are other things that we do to reduce the help desk that the cloud helps us with, things like self-service password reset and those types of settings. We can also provide much more granular access to apps. Instead of throwing people in groups in AD, we can provision them directly into that AD on-prem, the single group they need, give them the access to the app they need, and when they no longer need it, we can roll that access back. Makes compliant audits much less work, because as part of this, what we want to do is get a handle on where entitlements have been granted. Who has gotten access to what? How was it granted? When was it granted? And when was it removed? Those are all things that we need to have at our hands to be able to meet these compliance audits. And no matter the size of the organization, OCG is a rather small organization, but we still find that working with other companies, and we all have to work with other companies, we need to meet these compliance gates. So getting a handle on this is important regardless of the size of the organization if you want to continue to grow and do more business out in the world. We also get to right size licensing on premises. If we don't have people in the on-premises AD that we don't need, we don't have to pay for licenses for them. And this gives us really just an easy button for conditional access. When conditional access is set, then zero trust becomes very easy. That access management component of zero trust becomes very easy for us to operate. And as I said, if we treat everyone as kind of external workers, except the ones who actually have to be in on the on-premises piece, that makes that easier to do all of those conditional access policies. So again, we've got benefits. I kind of broke them out here in different ways. This is benefits for actual ADDS, right? For the on-premises things that we're talking about reducing. And there's a lot of talk out there. We're doing work for customers. There's AD cleanup, AD consolidation, whatever you want to call it, reducing the number of forests and domains. That we can help do that work here because, again, we're reducing the number of users on-prem. So we reduce the number of domains. We may be able to eliminate some domains or simply replace them. We can reduce those administrators that are running those domains. And as a result, we reduce risk, right? And we gain control. This is as a bonus, right? We have better control over what's going on in AD. A lot of people don't have a real robust system. So this is a good way to build that, take a fresh look at all of your identities on-prem and get a better handle on it. By reducing those users on-prem, not having as many users in our on-prem systems, we reduce that insider threat. Now, it could be malicious, could be somebody who's upset, who just reaches out on-prem to all of these things and does damage or shares information, or it could be an inadvertent, just a careless sharing or being phished, and some information exfiltrating, or it could even be ransomware. And if that user doesn't have access to anything on the on-prem, even if they're tricked into some ransomware, they have less access, they'll have less of a blast radius for this, less of an effect within the organization. Another real benefit for ADDS is that as we move to using Azure as the center and provisioning out to AD, we can provision just in time. So if someone needs, we call this in the Saviynt world, we call this firefighter access, but it is a break glass account. It's things are down and we can't get a hold of Bob, who normally does this stuff. So we need to give somebody the access. Okay, well, we go into the system, we request that access, and the user gets provisioned into that on-premises piece, given the privileged access that they need. The work is done, we're back up and running, and that user can be deprovisioned, so that account no longer sits there and is at risk for being compromised. There's benefits to security beyond those, right? We get separate privileged account. We reduce any risk of account spillover. One of the things that was discovered during the recent SolarWinds event was that a number of people were syncing, kind of unknowingly, syncing their domain admin accounts into the cloud and granting permissions to them in the cloud based on their group membership as well. And so these privileged accounts were leaking over from on-premises into the cloud. So once one was compromised, the other was compromised. And by breaking these off and treating everything as its own application and separating privileged accounts, we reduce that spillover issue. And we get right to the core of Zero Trust, which is least privilege. We don't give somebody the permissions they need. We don't give someone a standing domain admin account. We can raise them to that permission through governance, raise their permission level, give them new entitlements, and then again pull those back when they're no longer using them. So instead of having standing admin accounts or enterprise accounts or user account, whatever it might be, we can elevate to that and then pull back once we're done doing the work. We can also do this if we need to provide ADFS in support of legacy auth. We're doing this for a customer in the federal space. If you have unique federation requirements that you need to support ADFS, or in the case of federal, as we talk about, using certificate authentication in ADFS to provide CAC and PIV authentications. And again, we control who has access to that, maybe everybody, maybe not. And if you have a requirement for MFA using certificates, ADFS provides that. So you may choose to continue to use ADFS. One of the things we do, though, is we do probably want to get out of the ADFS piece because we're trying to move all of our authentication into Azure AD to get the benefits of those. And then another piece we get here is we start to actually see cross-domain separation or segregation of duties. So this is the idea where you don't want to let somebody create an invoice and pay an invoice. That's a separation of duties that you should have. No one should be able to start a process and complete it by themselves. And this is really hard to do if you don't have a good view of all of the domains or applications and things that you're using. So it's important to get this separation of duties correct, and by pulling back into this central Azure store and then managing that properly, we're able to gain that kind of benefit. We can also benefit in lift and shift. So if we are picking up services and moving them to the cloud for PaaS and actually using VMs and those kinds of things, there's a couple ways we can do it. One is this Azure Active Directory domain services. So this allows us to take all the users, kind of inverts the process as well, back again, takes the users from our Azure AD instance and exposes that as an AD directory services within the Azure cloud. So this allows us to take a machine, put it up there. It still can do Kerberos authentication, LDAP authentication, all those things it needs to, finds the users, is joined to the domain. All of those things work for us, so we can just simply lift and shift that. There are hybrid solutions that are applicable as well. If you lift and shift, you could just leave an MPLS or site-to-site VPN up and still bounce off your on-premises domain controllers for that services. There is some concern, people have done this over time, putting DCs up in the cloud, but there is a bit of a concern there. Again, James Cowling pointed this out to us all, where anybody who has operator permissions to a VM in the cloud is able to essentially own that domain controller. And so there is a risk that someone who has very basic operator permissions, so they can start and stop that domain controller, can reach in and change passwords and essentially take ownership of that domain controller. So it's probably not a great idea to do those DCs in the cloud because of that risk. If you're willing to accept that risk, then of course you can go ahead and do that, and maybe you limit the operators and provide some password vaulted way to protect it, or some other way. There's things that can be done, but it's something certainly to be aware of. But really, the end goal here is to get some governance around this on-premises, which is going to be here with us for quite a long time. We expect to be hybrid virtually forever, but at some point that may change. But currently, only about 16% of organizations have a robust identity access management or IGA governance solution, have a handle on their identities. So there's a lot of room to improve this in the world. It can be really difficult to implement a good governance solution in these legacy systems because you have to go in and do all the discovery. What are all the permissions? Who's accessing it? Who owns these things? And then you have to validate all of those permissions before you start pulling them away, so you don't take things away from people. So doing this at the same time, we do this motion of reducing the dependency on Active Directory allows us to kind of bring these things together, say who needs access to ADDS, then we get ownership of all the pieces, and we put that into a governance system, and we improve our standing quite a bit. So this is an example of a kind of simplified view of something we're doing for a customer, which is really this Savient driving the governance from Azure Active Directory. We have this source of truth out here in task trackpad problems. Source of truth is just provisions all of these users into Azure Active Directory with various attributes in them. Savient then picks up those users and provisions those users into various components, and you can see down here on the bottom left, I won't move my mouse to try and show it, is an Active Directory on-premises quote well, they're not air quotes, they're actual quotes, that allows us to do certificate authentication against this ADDS because this is required by this particular organization. And then we manage all of the rest of the applications. We expect that there will be more cloud apps provisioned, and we'll have to have more directory services for that, whether we do Active Directory domain services or provision some DCs within the cloud, we have to see. But we're also provisioning for things like GitHub, which is an interesting case, ServiceNow, where we're mapping up groups in Azure Active Directory and groups in ServiceNow to give us support for conditional access. And of course, all across the O365, we can do all of our license management from there, granting access and recovering licenses when people are deprovisioned through the system. It's kind of a simple diagram of it. Now, there are some issues you need to think about before you can really make this move, where you do this identity inversion and change what we term the source of truth. File shares. If you have a lot of file shares, this is something that will not be really particularly attractive to you because you have a lot of users who still have to connect to those file shares, and they need those on-prem ADDS accounts to be able to do that, to be able to authenticate to those file shares properly. Printing is another issue, although there are some solutions for that. Microsoft has universal printing, which uses a server online on-prem to reach into the cloud and pull printing jobs down and queue them for you. We have to determine endpoint management. This can be quite a big lift for people. As if we've been managing on-premises devices through SMS and maybe group policy objects and those kinds of things, we need to make that move out to some cloud-based system, an enterprise mobility management system, an EMM system such as Intune. I believe that virtually all of the things that we need to do that we were able to do through group policy, we can do through OMA URIs in Intune these days, and most of the policies that we were able to manage through, say, SMS, are able to be managed from Intune. And then the policies on computers, right? What are we doing as far as, do we have things such as a home drive, right? We may need to create that home drive out with the file share. There are some tools to help us do that. And then one of the big issues that was brought up that I hadn't even given much thought to, that Frank brought up to us, was all of these joined devices. So we have devices that are joined to the on-premises domain. We have devices that are hybrid joined to Azure AD, and then we have devices that are just pure Azure AD joined. And ultimately, what we'd want to get to is this just Azure AD joined. And so, as Frank calls out here, a major component to make this change is to move them over. And there's two different ways we can do this. Just create new device IDs, put them into Autopilot, and let those get provisioned, and we assume that Autopilot then does an Azure AD join for us. Or you can use the existing IDs that you can discover on these machines, import them into Autopilot, and then reset them for the out-of-box experience, the UBI. Those users will then authenticate, and Autopilot will run, and then we'll go ahead and sync them up. Now, if you need to retain user profiles, but you have to have you do some additional work, this USMT, or Windows part of the Windows assessment deployment, or there's some third-party solutions like this PC Mover app. So that's another thing to consider about moving. So who does this work for? Really, who can do this? Who's going to have issues with it? Anybody who's well down the zero trust path, the zero trust architecture path. If you're one of these internet first, cloud first organizations, if your first logon in the morning is to Azure, or your first logon, for me, my first logon is Windows Hello for Business, but I know that in the back it's going just to Azure. I'm not signing on to DC, so I am an internet first, cloud first organization. And this is really anybody with fewer on-premises resources, right? If you still got everything centered in on-premises, ADDS is still the center of your world, and that's not going to change, right? If we have a lot of frontline workers, like I said, hospitality, manufacturing, a lot of people who don't require access to that back-end stuff, you can start thinking about, do they really need ADDS accounts, or are they just in there to provision them to Azure? And this is an excellent motion for consolidating those AD domains, Active Directory domains and forests, by being able to get a handle on it, looking at it from a different view. You may find that a lot of these domains don't need to exist, that you don't need to have quite as many domains as we're decommissioning on-premises applications and we're moving more to SaaS applications. It's a good time to review these and see if all of these things really need to be around. And organizations looking for a governance solution but don't really have a clear path how to get there. And this can be difficult because, again, as I say, you have to get buy-in on who owns these entitlements, why users would have access to them, and then start collecting that data and creating processes around it. And of course, you is who you're here for this call because you thought this would be interesting, and so this may very well be a good path for you. And really, the big deal here, like most of these things we run into today, is a change management process, right? We have to determine who owns these entitlements, right? Who is allowed to authorize them, usually probably the same person, I guess, and then who verifies them, maybe the same person, maybe someone else, all right? So in the products that we use, normally we have an access request system. Users can come and request access to applications. That then goes through a workflow process that determines who should get the access. It may go through one or more approvals, and as long as that's approved, then the user gets provisioned. They may be provisioned on a time-limited basis, or they may just be provisioned and we review that provisioning later on. We are able to do, well, I didn't want to talk so much about Savient today, but one of the things in Savient that we can do is look at the risk of those entitlements and only do reviews of the more risky ones on a frequent basis, and the less risky ones, like access to a team site, probably wouldn't require review as frequently as access to the financial systems. So doing all of this and moving up to Azure AD and getting kind of a clean view of it builds a good foundation for this compliance. And we start treating everything out from our single identity, which again, core tenet of Zero Trust, single identity in Azure. We build out from there to all of the places we have applications, and the directory of Active Directory on premises becomes just another application that we provision and deprovision use to. So we're doing this work with customers now. We have a couple of customers who are actually making this motion. When I brought this stuff up to 2 people, I had some other people on our team who were saying, oh yeah, I have a customer who'd be good for this, and we're actually doing that work. And as a result of reviewing this webinar with those people, people thought it might be good to follow on with additional webinars or perhaps white papers on how this motion actually works. So look for those coming out shortly. And want to talk a little bit about toolings. I guess I've said enough about governance, but getting some system, and there are tools being built in Azure. They're certainly not as full featured as a solution like Savient or any of the other, well, there aren't that many, but any of the other governance solutions. But Microsoft is building governance into Azure, and we certainly expect that to get stronger over time. And for simpler setups, for more limited provisioning, deprovisioning, that may be all you need out of Azure AD. It certainly is heading that way. There are tools to help with file share migration, so moving file shares up into Azure, and you can still do some SMB connections to those file shares, provided you have the access and everything, so people can still have that drive that they're used to seeing from their M drive or whatever it might happen to be that they're used to finding their files. We can redirect those to a OneDrive for Business SharePoint location. There are tools out there to help you with that. Azure AD Connect now with the ability to sync security groups back from Azure AD and the access request functions up there. You could start managing your on-premises groups from the tools that are in Azure AD. It's certainly not, as I said, certainly not the full-blown governance solution, and it's not going to do the discovery for you that a lot of these governance solutions will. I mean, when we start installing these things, one of the first things they do is it goes out and grabs all the entitlements, which means ADDS grabs all the groups, and you can see all of that right away. AD Connect doesn't give you that much depth, but you can start doing things to get a handle on those on-premises groups from the cloud and start that motion. As I mentioned, universal print also allows you to give people who are out in the cloud access to those printers that you have on-prem. There are printers that are set to work with universal print, and there's also a connector that can be used for printers that are not aware of it. I was looking through some of that stuff, and I was happy to see that they didn't confuse the terms of printer and print spooler and all that stuff as much as they did in Active Directory on-prem. And if you really feel like you want to get down and dirty and you don't mind the pain, there's a lot of stuff that can be done with WMI to help you determine all of the users you have, being able to pull information out of the directory, put it in spreadsheets and spend lots of time digging through it. Another way to go through it to try and do that, but there are better tools out there to help you manage this stuff. So I think that's about all I've got for you today. We can go ahead and do some questions. I don't know if we had any questions sitting there. It doesn't. Let me take a look in the list here. I don't see any. We'll give a couple minutes, see if anybody wants to pop any questions. I appreciate everybody showing up for the call today. I hope this was informative. It's something we've been thinking and talking about a good deal internally, and it just seems like we're hitting that tipping point for this. That we're getting to the part where people are actually looking at this and making this move. I'm sorry, I'm seeing something that's saying my audio is degrading. I hope it's not too bad on your end. But again, I don't see any questions, so I think I'm.
We actually do have one, Mark, from Sam.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
I do see it. Let me see if I can tooling sync from one AD to multiple separate ADDS domains. Yeah, oh, actually, that's not a problem, because if we're using a governance solution and we're talking to these directory services, we can have as many of those endpoints as we want to, and it really is just connecting to AD and doing the normal things that we would, provisioning and deprovisioning, but we're driving that all out of AAD. And so, yeah, we can have multiple domains. We specifically drive to them. We have a couple of cases where we have multiple Azure or multiple ADDS domains. We also have customers who have multiple Azure instances that we manage from a governance solution. So yeah, those can all be done. I'm sorry, I didn't see the last bit of it here. AD Connect. What can AD Connect handle multiples? There is I haven't, to be honest, I haven't dug into it too much, but the Cloud Sync allows you to have multiple inbound domains into an Azure AD. So part of the problem is how you would manage that. AD Connect really doesn't give you the ability to say, I want to put this account in this domain and that account in that domain and this account in the third domain. A good, robust governance solution, of course, allows you to do all of that. I hope that answers the question. All right, so I guess I'll hand it back to Jackie, and she can close out the recording and make the recording available if anybody's interested. And if you do have follow-up questions or have an interest in this space, please feel free to reach out to us. And thanks again for your time.